What if I told you that one of the most iconic snowboarding games of all time was born not on the slopes, but in an office, as a part of a last-ditch effort to make a splash on a brand new console? It's the year 2000. Extreme sports are blowing up. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater had already redefined skateboarding games, and every publisher wanted in. But snowboarding games? Those were a different story. Mostly forgettable, clunky, and too obsessed with realism. Enter SSX. Launching alongside the PlayStation 2, SSX didn't just make snowboarding fun, it made it electric. Giant air, impossible tricks, and heart-pounding speed turned the slopes into a playground. It was loud, stylish, and unapologetically arcade. And yet, it wasn't just about being flashy. Behind the chaos was precision, polish, and a clear vision. Take the spirit of snowboarding and crank it to 11. To understand how SSX became a genre-defining game, you have to start with one name. Steve Rettschaffer. Steve Rettschaffer? I'm going to have to Google how to say that. But yeah, Steve wasn't just a game developer, he was a guy with snowboarding in his blood. Before stepping into the gaming industry, Steve worked on an NBC sports segment covering snowboarding events. He loved the sports energy, the culture, and the creativity it allowed. But when it came to snowboarding games of the late 90s, they just didn't capture that. They were slow, clunky, and quite honestly, boring. Where was the fun? The rush, the style. Steve saw an opportunity. When Electronic Arts started ramping up for the PlayStation 2 launch, he pitched an idea that was as bold as it was risky. What if a snowboarding game didn't care about realism? What if it embraced the impossible? Instead of imitating real life, the game would celebrate it, pushing speed, tricks, and adrenaline to the extreme. EA's response? Go for it. But Steve wasn't just pitching a game, he was pitching an entire brand. EA Sports Big was born out of this vision. A label dedicated to arcade-style sports games that were about fun first and realism second. SSX would be its flagship title, the game that proved what EA Sports Big could deliver. Now came the hard part, making it a reality. To do that, Steve turned to EA Canada, the Vancouver-based studio with a strong pedigree in sports games. But this project? This wasn't your typical EA Sports sim. Steve needed a team that thought differently, that could break the mold of what a snowboarding game was supposed to be. The developers who joined the SSX project weren't just coders and artists, they were creators. They wanted to build something that felt right, something fast, slick, and alive. Instead of getting caught up in the physics engines or snow simulation, they focused on making every second feel dynamic and rewarding. And the core idea was simple: style, speed, skill. Those three words became the foundation of SSX. Steve and his team decided that every design choice, whether it was track layouts, trick mechanics, or controls, had to serve those three ideas. Snowboarding, as they saw it, wasn't about realism. It was about the flow, the freedom, and the ridiculousness of what could be done on a board. The team also knew they couldn't afford to cut corners. The PlayStation 2 was about to hit the market, and EA wanted SSX to showcase what the new hardware could be. If the game fell flat, it wouldn't just hurt EA, it could hurt the entire launch of the PlayStation 2 in North America. It was an all-or-nothing scenario. But even when the pressure was on, the team stayed focused. Steve once described their approach as building an experience rather than just a game. They wanted the player to feel the rush of bombing down a mountain at 100 miles per hour, pulling off absurd tricks that no real snowboarder could ever attempt. And most importantly, they wanted it to feel fun. That meant making controls intuitive, the tracks memorable, and the pacing perfect.
Our course is just the size of them. We've always had technology that allowed us to build huge courses.
If you asked any fan what made SSX special, they'd probably say it's the feel of the game. Not just the way it played, but the way it moved, the way it flowed, and the way it pulled you into its world. From the moment you dropped onto the track, SSX felt like nothing else at the time. At its core, the game was built around three things: the tracks, the trick system, and the sense of speed. Each of these pillars was meticulously designed, creating a gameplay loop that was both addictive and endlessly satisfying. First, let's talk about the tracks. Unlike other snowboarding games that stuck to the simple, flat courses, SSX gave players sprawling mountains that felt alive. Tracks like Elysium Alps, Mercury City Meltdown, and Snow Dream weren't just backdrops, they were playgrounds. You carved through icy chasms, bomb down steep drops, launch off massive jumps, and thread your way through narrow shortcuts. Each course was filled with ramps, rails, and alternative paths, rewarding players who took the time to explore. Then there was the verticality. Most snowboarding games at the time felt like you were sliding downhill on a straight path. SSX took that idea and cranked it up. The tracks were multi-layered and massive, with insane drops and jumps that made you feel like you were falling forever. You could take one line on a track and the next time find 3 others you completely missed. It turned snowboarding into a game of discovery. But what really set SSX apart was the trick system. It wasn't about the subtle grabs or rotations, it was about doing the impossible and making it look really good. The game gave you a massive arsenal of tricks to pull off, from exaggerated board grabs to outlandish spins and flips. And when I say exaggerated, I mean it. Characters would twist their bodies mid-air like they were made of rubber, pulling off tricks that defied gravity and physics. The trick system worked because it was simple to learn but deep enough to master. Pulling off basic tricks was as easy as hitting a button and tilting the stick. But as you got better, you could start linking tricks together. Grabs into flips, into spins, chaining combos for massive points. And the longer you held the trick, the more daring it felt. You'd push it right to the last second, pulling out of a spin just before you smashed into the snow. And here's the kicker. Tricks weren't just for show. They fueled your boost meter. Every time you nailed a trick, you earn a boost of speed you could use to rocket past opponents. This created a constant risk-reward loop. Do you focus on tricks to build your boost, or do you play it safe and race straight to the finish? And let's not forget the characters. SSX gave us a roster full of colorful, over-the-top personalities that fit perfectly with the game's tone. There was Elise, the confident pro with a flair for style. Mac, the hyperactive kid with a love for tricks. Moby, the Brit with an attitude. And Kaora, the energetic Japanese rider who became an instant fan favorite. Each character had their own stats, style, and quirks, giving players a chance to find someone that fit their playstyle. Together, the tracks, tricks, speed, and characters created something that felt like pure magic. Whether you were racing to the finish line or chasing high scores, SSX kept you coming back.
Around it. That's right, it's a snowboarding title, unlike anything you've ever seen before. Check it out, SSX.
In the year 2000, gaming was standing at the edge of a new frontier. The PlayStation 2 wasn't just another console, it was a game changer. Sony's new hardware was hyped to push graphics, performance, and realism to levels that hadn't been seen before. And SSX, it was one of the very first games to show the world what this machine could do. Back then, developers were still figuring out how to squeeze power out of the PlayStation 2. For SSX, that wasn't just a challenge, it was an opportunity. EA Canada wanted the game to feel big. They weren't just going for realistic mountains or tame snow physics, they were going for something more ambitious. Tracks that sprawled across massive, vertical spaces, dynamic effects that gave the snow life, and gameplay that never stuttered, even when the chaos broke out on screen. It started with the tracks. The PS2's processing power allowed EA to build courses that were longer, more detailed, and far more vertical than anything players had seen before. As mentioned earlier, tracks like Elysium Alps felt endless, stretching far into the distance with multiple layers, split paths, and massive jumps. Every track was built with fluidity in mind. No jagged transitions, no loading screens, just one seamless ride from the starting gate to the finish line. That feeling of scale wasn't just a design choice, it was a flex of the PlayStation 2's horsepower. Then there was the snow. In earlier snowboarding games, snow was just white texture pasted onto the ground, lifeless and flat. But SSX changed that. The game's real-time snow deformation system was the first for the genre. As you carved down the mountain, your board left a trail in the snow, cutting through powder and kicking up particle effects. You could see the impact of every sharp turn, every big landing, and every boost-fueled carve. It wasn't just visual fluff, it grounded you in the world. The snow felt real, even when the gameplay itself defied the laws of physics. And speaking of physics, the team had a clear vision. Gravity should feel exaggerated, not restricted. The PlayStation 2 gave them the tools to build a trick system that felt responsive, fluid, and completely over the top. Characters could launch off ramps and hang in the air for what felt like an eternity, twisting and flipping in ways that were utterly ridiculous, but also ridiculously fun. The PlayStation 2's improved animations brought those tricks to life, with smooth transitions between grabs, flips, and landings. It gave SSX a sense of polish that most games at the time simply didn't have. Underneath all of this was a technical engine built to keep SSX feeling smooth. The PlayStation 2 allowed the game to maintain a steady frame rate, even when you were boosting through particle-heavy effects, surrounded by dynamic snow trails with music and sound effects blaring in the background. That was no small feat in 2000. The game felt fast because it was fast. There were no hitches, no stutters, just pure momentum.
competition. And I can keep playing it over and over and over. I love competing at it.
When the PlayStation 2 launched in North America on October 26 of 2000, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Sony's new console was positioned as the most powerful gaming hardware ever made, promising a leap forward in graphics, gameplay, and immersion. But here's the thing about console launches. They live and die by their games. A console can't win players over on tech specs alone. It needs something that feels next-gen. For the PS2, that game was SSX. At the time, the PlayStation 2 launch lineup was solid but not spectacular. It had variety, fighting games, racing sims, platformers, but nothing that truly screamed, "You need to play this." Then came SSX. Loud, bold, and completely unlike anything else on the shelf. It stood out immediately. It wasn't just a snowboarding game, it was a statement. And when players got their hands on it, they knew they were experiencing something special. Critics and fans agreed almost instantly. SSX wasn't just one of the best launch games, it was arguably the best. The term killer app gets thrown around a lot, but for the PS2, SSX fit the bill. It wasn't the kind of game you could have played on the PlayStation 1. The sprawling tricks, dynamic snow, fluid trick system, etc., all of it showed off what the PS2 could do. It was a perfect showcase for the console's power and massive leap forward in snowboarding games. The reviews reflected that impact. GameSpot gave SSX a 9.4, praising its visuals, controls, and depth. IGN called it a revolutionary step for the genre, awarding it a 9.3 and hailing its combination of style and substance. Even publications that weren't into sports games couldn't deny it. SSX was fun, polished, and wildly addictive. It was the rare launch game that didn't feel rushed or unfinished. Instead, it felt like a fully realized vision, crafted by a team that knew exactly what they were doing. But what really made SSX shine was its broad appeal. Snowboarding was still a niche sport in 2000, but SSX didn't care whether you loved the sport or had never stepped foot on a mountain. It wasn't about understanding snowboarding, it was about the joy of movement, speed, and spectacle. Whether you are a hardcore gamer chasing high scores or someone just looking to pick up a controller and have fun, SSX had something for you. By the end of 2000, SSX had cemented itself as a standout title in the PS2's early lineup. It didn't just meet expectations, it exceeded them. For players, it was an unforgettable experience. For Sony, it was a selling point for the PS2, and for EA, it was proof that the gamble on EA Sports Big had paid off.
So that's all really about the gameplay. The graphics are good for a PS2 game.
Looking back, SSX wasn't just a game, it was a vibe. It took snowboarding, injected it with energy drinks, strapped on a jetpack, and told physics to sit this one out. At a time when gaming was starting to take itself a little too seriously, SSX showed up and said, "Relax, let's just have some fun." Now, while SSX didn't change the world, it was definitely a game that let you fly, flip, and race your way to glory while leaving a spray of snow in your wake. And hey, if you ever hear someone say snowboarding games are boring, just sit them down, hand them a copy of SSX, and watch their minds melt as they boost their way off a jump, soaring into orbit like a caffeinated astronaut. Because SSX wasn't just a snowboarding game, it was the snowboarding game. And no matter how many years pass, it still feels like the ride of a lifetime. If you enjoyed exploring the history and making of SSX, click this video here to see more from the Retro Reload. And as always, thank you for watching.